In October 1347, 12 Genoese ships docked at the port of Iwuchapapwatch in Sicily. The sailors were already dead or dying. Their bodies were covered in black swellings the size of apples. In the next 7 years, between a third and half of Europe died, but the story almost nobody tells is what happened next. For 500 years before that ship arrived in Sicily, the ordinary peasant of Europe lived in a system that, by modern standards, looks impossible to escape. He was a serf, legally bound to his lord's land. He could not leave without permission. No, he could not refuse work. He worked his lord's fields for free, for 3 days every week for his entire life. He paid the lord for the right to grind his own grain, for the right to bake his own bread, sometimes for the right to marry. The lord did not have to pay him because there was always another peasant. Always. For 5 centuries, Europe had been getting more people, and by the early 1300s, it had too many. The population had outrun the food. A great famine in 1315 had already killed perhaps 1 in 8 people across northern Europe. The system was strained, but the labor relation, bound peasant, paying lord, that had not changed since. Then a ship docked in Sicily. Within months, the plague was in Genoa, Marseille, Venice. By the summer of 1348, it was in Paris and London. By 1349, it had reached Norway by way of a single ghost ship that washed ashore at Bergen with its entire crew dead. By 1353, it had reached Moscow, 5,000 kilometers in 6 years, the fastest pandemic expansion in human history before the age of steam. The disease was bubonic plague, caused by a bacterium we now call C, carried by fleas living primarily on rats. The bacterium was identified in 1894 by the Swiss researcher during a similar outbreak in Hong Kong. The 14th century had no microscopes, no germ theory, no concept of a bacterium. What they had was the symptoms: fever, vomiting, then the swellings in the groin and armpits, buboes, the Latin word for swellings, hence bubonic. Within 5 to 7 days, most of the infected were dead. The mortality was unlike anything in recorded human memory. In the worst-hit regions of Central and Southern Europe, 6 in 10 people died in 7 years. In Florence, the writer watched it happen. In the introduction to a book he started writing during the plague, a frame narrative of 10 young people fleeing the dying city, he wrote what is now the most famous Western description of any pandemic. So great was the cruelty of heaven, and perhaps also that of man. When the plague finally burned out in 1351, somewhere between 30 and 50% of Europe's population was gone. Some regions had it worse. Florence lost roughly 40% of its 120,000 inhabitants, lost 70%. The city stopped construction on its cathedral expansion, and 800 years later, the half-finished walls still stand. Across the continent, entire villages were simply emptied. In some English manors, when the king's surveyors came back to count the living, there were no inhabitants at all, only empty cottages and unplowed strips. Here's what almost nobody tells you about the Black Death. For 500 years, the labor relation across Europe had run on the basic mathematics of too many people, not enough land. Lords paid nothing for labor because they did not have to. In 7 years, that mathematics inverted. Suddenly, there were not enough peasants to work the land. A surviving peasant who had a brother, a son, a neighbor to fall back on in 1346 might be one of one remaining son in 1351. And he discovered in some specific Tuesday, in some specific village, in some specific lord's estate, a fact that had been theoretically true for half a millennium, but practically untrue. He could leave. He could walk 20 miles to another lord. Another lord who had lost most of his workforce and was desperate. And that lord would pay an actual silver coin. Wages. This had not happened in 1,000 years. Across England, in the years immediately after the plague, wages rose between 12 and 28%. In some manors, they doubled. Lords competed against each other for surviving laborers. A peasant who had been worth nothing as an individual, a decade earlier, was now negotiating his daily rate. The economic foundation that feudalism rested on, on abundant cheap labor, had been incinerated. The kings of Europe noticed. This episode is brought to you by an applied history community that studies exactly this pattern. when a sudden shock reprices the things society thought it had already priced. Labor scarcity after a catastrophe, currency repricing after a war, land repricing after a colonization. The mechanism repeats, the institutions get rewritten, and the people inside it rarely notice in time. If you want the unedited archive, the moments where a single input changed and everything downstream had to follow, the link is in the description. Now, Cascade, back to 1351. In June of 1349, while the plague was still actively killing people in northern England, King Edward III's council passed emergency crisis legislation. The Ordinance of Laborers, a one-page hurried law, required every able-bodied person under 60 to work, banned employers from paying more than the wages of 1346, and made it illegal for workers to leave their jobs without permission. It did not work. 2 years later, Parliament passed the more comprehensive Statute of Laborers in February 1351. It set specific maximum wages for every trade, imprisonment and fines for both worker and employer who broke the cap. A new institution created specifically to enforce it, the Justices of the Peace, the foundation of English local government for the next 600 years. By the 1370s, 30 to 40% of court cases in some English counties were wage cap prosecutions, showing both that the law was being applied, that violations were so widespread that the courts could not keep up. Because the law was unenforceable, lords needed labor more than they needed to obey their king. They paid above the cap and dared each other to report it. The legal economy and the actual economy diverged. Everyone could see it. By the late 1370s, that visible hypocrisy combined with something else. In 1380, England was deep in the 100 Years' War with France and broke. To pay for it, Parliament passed a third poll tax in 4 years, 1 shilling per adult, regardless of income. For a laborer earning 2 pence a day, that was 3 days' wages demanded in cash on top of all the other taxes he already paid. The peasantry, newly conscious of its leverage, newly aware that the king's law was a polite fiction, refused. On the 30th of May, 1381, a royal tax commissioner went to Essex to collect unpaid taxes. The villagers chased him out. Within 2 weeks, similar refusals were happening across Essex and Kent. By early June, the rebellion was organized. They had a preacher named a radical priest who had been imprisoned for sermons critical of feudal hierarchy. The rebels broke him out of jail. At a place called the Outside London, Ball preached to the assembled rebels, something that would not be safely sayable again in English for 300 years. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? If God had made all men equal in the garden, then who exactly had decided that some men would inherit estates and others would labor on them? On the 13th of June, 1381, the rebels entered London. The 14-year-old king, Richard II, met them the next day at Mile End and agreed to all their demands. Abolition of serfdom, free pardons for everyone involved, fair rents, in writing. While that meeting was happening, a faction of rebels broke into the Tower of London itself. They seized the Archbishop of Canterbury, the man who had served as Lord Chancellor and was widely held responsible for the poll tax. They seized Robert Hales, the king's treasurer. They seized John Legge, the tax commissioner. They dragged all 3 to Tower Hill and beheaded them. Their heads were placed on poles and paraded through the streets of London. It was the first time in English history that a mob had executed an Archbishop of Canterbury. There had been one previous Archbishop of Canterbury murdered in office, Thomas Becket, in 1170, but that had been by the king's knights. This was by peasants. Yet the next day, the 15th of June, Richard II met the rebel leader again, this time at a field called Surrey, just outside the city walls. What happened in the next 10 minutes is still debated by historians. The mayor of London, William Walworth, drew a sword, apparently because Tyler had spoken too familiarly to the king or had reached toward his weapon. Walworth wounded Tyler, who turned his horse and rode for the nearest sanctuary, St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Royal soldiers pursued him there and killed him. The young king then rode out to the assembled rebel army alone and said one of the most coolly brilliant things any English monarch has ever said. "I will be your captain." The peasants, without Tyler, exhausted, suddenly leaderless and addressed by the king himself, dispersed. In the weeks that followed, royal forces hunted the rebel leaders across Essex, Kent, and East Anglia. John Ball was hanged, drawn, and quartered on the 15th of July, 1381. The promises Richard had made at Mile End were rescinded. On paper, the revolt failed. In reality, the revolt won. Quietly, over the next 20 years, there was no further poll tax in England for 600 years. Not until Margaret Thatcher tried in 1989 and provoked another set of riots. The Statute of Laborers stayed on the books, but stopped being enforced. Lords paid market wages, peasants left estates that did not pay well, and moved to ones that did. By 1400, serfdom was effectively extinct in England. A century after the plague, the descendants of the survivors had become something Europe had not had in 1,000 years. They had become wage earners. Here's the cascade that almost nobody traces. When ordinary peasants had cash income for the first time in European history, small amounts but real silver pennies they controlled themselves, that cash created demand. Cloth, iron tools, salt, books eventually, goods that in the feudal economy only nobles had bought. To meet that demand, merchants expanded. Trade networks that had moved silk and spices for kings began moving woolens and hardware for commoners. Long-distance trade needed financial infrastructure, bills of exchange, letters of credit, double-entry bookkeeping. The Italian city-states, Florence, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, became the world's first true banking centers. In 1397, 50 years after the Black Death, a Florentine merchant named Giovanni di Bicci de founded a bank. By the time his son Cosimo died 70 years later, the Medici Bank was the largest financial institution in Europe, banker to the Pope, with branches in Rome, Milan, Venice, Bruges, Lyon, Geneva, and London. And then the Medici did something that in the feudal economy of 1347 would have been impossible. They used the bank's profits to fund art. Its Dome of Florence Cathedral is sculptures, is Primavera and Birth of Venus, a young apprentice in a Medici patronized workshop called Leonardo da Vinci, a teenager who lived in the Medici household. The Italian Renaissance was materially the Black Death's post-mortem dividend. Without the wage economy that the plague forced into existence, there were no commoners with disposable income, no merchant class with serious capital, no banking system to channel that capital, and no patrons to commission Brunelleschi's dome. And then, in around 1440 in Dachau, Germany, a goldsmith named finished a project he had been working on for years. Movable type printing. The first major book off the press was the 42-line Bible, completed around 1455. By 1500, 50 years after the first press, there were printing presses in 250 European cities and roughly 20 million printed books in circulation, more books printed in 50 years than had been hand-copied in the previous 1,000. That printed network is what made the scientific revolution possible. Copernicus could publish on the revolutions of the celestial spheres in 1543. Galileo could correspond with Kepler. Newton could read Galileo. The whole institutional infrastructure of modern science, universities, journals, peer review, citation, runs on top of printing. The Enlightenment of the 18th century rested on the scientific revolution. The modern world, industrial production, universal literacy, representative democracy, secular law, human rights, rests on the Enlightenment. None of those steps was inevitable. Any one of them could have broken, and in regions that did not experience the plague-specific institutional shock, like much of East Asia, the chain ran differently. But in Europe, the chain ran, and the first link in it was a ship docking in Sicily in October 1347. Here's what the Black Death story is actually about. The wage economy, the entire idea that you trade your labor for money, rather than for the right to keep living on someone else's land, feels so basic to modern life that it can be hard to remember it had a beginning. It had a beginning. The beginning was a bacterial infection that killed 40% of Europe in 7 years. The labor relation that we now call employment was forced into existence by a catastrophe that nobody planned, nobody wanted, and nobody understood at the time. The people inside it could not see what was happening. They thought the world was ending, by any reasonable definition of the world they had known. It was. What they could not see, what nobody could have seen in 1348, was that the institutional reset their grandchildren would live inside would be the foundation of every major step toward the modern world. The Renaissance was paid for in plague money. The middle class was born from a flea. This is the pattern Chronicle keeps returning to, because history keeps returning to it. A catastrophe arrives. The institutions that were already structurally weak, feudal labor, imperial currency, a centralized economy, break under the shock. The people inside experience only loss. The generation after, born into a different system, can no longer imagine the old one. 2 centuries later, we run our own experiments, some chosen, some imposed, some we don't yet have names for. The question is not whether the next shock will reorganize the institutions we currently take for granted. It will. The question is whether, when our grandchildren look back, they will be living inside the next Renaissance, or inside something else. The port at Messina is still there. You can stand on the same stone quay today. The ships that arrived in 1347 left no physical trace. The dead from the plague were buried in mass graves that were reused for centuries afterward. Most are unmarked. What did leave a trace is everything that came after. The wage economy, the Italian banking system, the printing press, the scientific revolution, the modern democratic state. Every institution you live inside today is, in some causal sense, a distant grandchild of that October afternoon. The people in charge in 1347 thought they were witnessing the end of their world. They were right. What they could not see was that they were also accidentally witnessing the beginning of ours. History remembers what power forgets.